This is a fairly important transitional slide because, as you'll note from the title or the subtitle, we're talking about, or going to talk about, the integration and synchronization of buy-side activities. So as you'll note in the lower left-hand side of our slide, the red bracket, it's that supplier relationship management manufacturing environment may be outsourced, may be conducted by our organization, but either way, we're talking specifically about materials management, MRP, material requirements planning, and buy-side activities. So the acquisition of raw materials that go into making a finished product, the quantity of which is dependent upon, at least initially, the forecast for finished products. So forecasting of independent demand, raw materials oriented products is never done. We engage in forecasting for independent demand finished goods that will drive the amount of raw materials that we need to acquire. Okay, so buy-side activities, and here's where that terminology, specific terminology, comes into play even further. MRP, traditional, going back to the 1970s and probably even earlier origins of MRP related to the acquisition of raw materials. So that will continue. When we talk MRP, we're talking about raw materials acquisition, procurement of raw materials that go into a production process, the quantities of which, again, are driven, at least initially, by a forecast. Sales and operations planning will compel us to make adjustments to that forecast based on actual outcomes, which will change the quantities of raw materials that we're acquiring, but it does start indeed with a forecast. So having said that, our first bullet point, MRP, it's a time-phased approach. There's that time element out into the future, week 1, week 2, week 3 of a year. How much raw materials are we going to need in each period to meet the demands of the production schedule? So it's a time-phased approach to planning for the procurement of raw materials that will go into a production process. We saw this in our graphic and mentioned it a couple times. We'll say it again here in bullet point number 2. MRP activities are based on the master production schedule. Somebody somewhere, either ourselves as a manufacturer or an outsourced contract manufacturer, will have to develop a master production schedule. What's going to be made where, in what factories around the world, in what quantities, to get supply chains moving. Again, that will be based on a forecast, at least initially. And the master production schedule, because it determines quantities to be made, that's what's going to drive the need or determine the quantities of raw materials that we'll need. That's what MRP does. So in our hash marks, what products will be manufactured on the MPS, the master production schedule, what quantities, and during a specific time bucket. We haven't defined or used that terminology yet, although we've said it a couple of times. We'll be explicit. Time bucket is a time period, usually a week. So time bucket 52 would be the last week of a calendar year. So you'll see that term moving forward, but MRP is based on specific time buckets. How much raw materials will we need in week 1, week 2, week 3? Those are time buckets. Getting into the details on MRP, and we'll continue to use that acronym as we move forward. Somewhat of a reiteration of what we've already said. Forecasts for finished goods, that independent demand, are what drive the master production schedule and the MRP. How do we know what to schedule to make if we don't have a forecast? And how can we get the raw materials we need if we don't know what the production schedule is, which is based on the forecast? So hash mark, independent demand for finished goods drives dependent demand. Said this a bunch of times. It's really important. This whole idea of the cascade effect that we started talking about in the graphic that we saw and will continue to resonate across our entire conversation. Here's something we haven't talked about either. Bullet point number 2. MRPs, materials planning for specific products, a pair of shoes, medical CAT scan device, whatever it happens to be. Materials planning for specific products is driven by what's called a bill of material. And it's really just a list of all the ingredients and in what quantities those ingredients are needed to make a specific product. So think about it as a recipe for the raw materials that go into making a product. What do we need and in what quantities do we need them? That is what a bill of material does, sometimes referred to as a BOM, a B-O-M. So you'll hear bill of material, you'll hear B-O-M, you'll hear BOM, it's all the same thing. It's to a specific product, and it's just, again, think of it as a recipe of raw materials that go into making that pair of shoes, that CAT scan equipment, whatever it happens to be that we're working with. From a technology perspective, and I said in Module 1 that we'd tie in technology to all of our conversations. This is a good first example of that. Some of the good news is that there are vast amounts of software packages in the market today that provide product-specific information on what to order, in what quantities, and when to place a purchase order. So that cascading effect that we've talked about as sales and operations planning alters what was originally forecast, what is really happening, and changes happen in production schedules and MRP, etc. That's all handled by software. Doesn't mean it's going to come out perfect, because the old technology adage, garbage in, garbage out, very much applies here. So if a forecast for a product is just inherently flawed, every single thing that happens from that point moving forward, master production schedules, MRP activities, is going to be wrong as well. So we're not trying to give the impression that software is going to save the day. The software is only as good as the information that gets into it. But it's much, much easier to execute on MRP activities with the software that is out there. So it's important to bring that up. Continuing on with MRP, as part of the S&OP process, master production scheduling and material requirements planning, quantities will change based on those updated forecasts, the adjustments that we've said ad nauseum in our recent discussion. In our hash points, adjustments are made to the MPS and MRP driven by actual demand, that whole idea of consuming the forecast. How quickly we can get access to that information and apply it to forecast and consume the forecast. Maybe we didn't make enough, maybe we made too much of a given product. That's the essence of sales and operations planning, and it's very, very much influenced by materials planning. Two essential activities, really, really important, related to MRP are called gross to net exploding and lead time offsetting. We're going to stop and really dedicate some time to defining these two terms, because they're just so important to not just MRP, but conceptually to all of supply chain management, because it really comes down to inventories available in a supply chain, in this particular case raw material inventory, but also the idea of lead time, planning out into the future. When are we going to need materials in our production environment, our production sites around the world, and how do we make sure that it gets there in the right quantity? The exercise, now software-based exercise of gross to net exploding and lead time offsetting is probably, and this is a professional opinion, one of the most important integrating functions found in the supply chain discipline, because it ties in purchasing, it integrates logistics, manufacturing, and ultimately the sale of goods in such a way that it would be hard to find a more integrating function than this. I can't emphasize enough how important this is, because it's critical to MRP, but conceptually applicable in other areas. Gross to net exploding and lead time offsetting. We're going to define them in detail in just a moment. MRP, and I just said this, has a direct impact on sales as well. Can't sell a finished product unless you make it. You can't make it unless you have the raw material. That's direct impact on sales. How expensive the MRP process is impacts landed costs, certainly lead times, as well as inventory levels. And we will illustrate these points over and over again moving forward.